Thank you for joining us for School Refusal, What Works? My name is Phoebe James and I'm a Professional Development Officer with the Hunter New England and Central Coast Primary Health Network. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that we are all meeting on today. I am coming to you from beautiful Awabakal land and pay my respects to elders past, present and any First Nations people joining us tonight. Just a little housekeeping, this webinar is being recorded and will be available in the Education Library on the PHN website in the following days. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so if you have any questions, please use the questions box and we'll get to as many as we can. We are very lucky today to have presenting for us Claire McMahon, who is the Director of Art Psychology. Claire has worked as a psychologist for 14 years in a range of different settings and most recently has accepted a role as Manager of Student Wellbeing for Sydney Catholic Schools. I'll now hand over to Claire.
Hello and welcome everyone. I'm very excited today to be talking about a complex issue that I know, I'll just make sure that I've got my slides up here. A very complex issue and one that we really need to come together on. So I'm really excited to share some latest research and be talking to you about the issue of school refusal. Now I'm just going to make sure, Phoebe, are my slides coming up there?
No, I can see your desktop.
Okay. For some reason they just skipped out. Okay, I'm just gonna, sorry about this, I'm just gonna go up here. They just disappeared for some reason. There we go. Sorry about that. So I've been working as a psychologist predominantly in education for the past 14 years. And I'm just about to start a new role, which is managing the wellbeing across all of Sydney Catholic schools. And I know from being at the coalface, working in schools, that school refusal is a really significant issue, a complex issue, and one that requires stakeholders to be working together. And the rates of it have increased, certainly since COVID. So I think it's a very important issue. School refusal is an interesting term because it often makes it seem as if a young person is deliberately not wanting to go to school. But it's very different to a student who is not wanting to go to school because they're being disobedient or it's more antisocial in nature. So school refusal is certainly a young person experiencing distress at the idea of going to or staying at school. And I assume because people are joining this webinar, they probably have seen some of that distress in some capacity. I've certainly seen significant distress for students trying to get into school, parents trying to get them out of, young people out of the car, and it being very distressing and upsetting for all people involved. And it's also different to something called school withdrawal, where it's a parent not wanting their young person to go to school. School refusal, the name school refusal, like I said, is a bit controversial. And there has been some, lately there's been some calls to have a universal name that we use, whether it's school avoidance or school can't is another term that people have started to use. I've used school refusal just because I know a lot of people use that and know what it means. Prevalence, this is very difficult to gather exact data on the prevalence of school refusal. Most studies point to about 1 to 5% of all students, but we've certainly seen that increase since COVID. And there was a Greens poll that was conducted of over 1,000 parents, and that was done in late 2022. And that showed that about 2 in 5 families had experienced, their child had experienced some kind of school refusal due to stress and anxiety. So it is quite significant. The numbers are difficult to gather because schools record absenteeism differently. And also school refusal can be masked by things like physical illness Stomach complaints and headaches are quite a common one. So sometimes it's listed as a sickness, and so it's difficult for there to be gathered data around how many students are actually showing school refusal behaviours. In terms of the features of school refusal, there is certainly severe emotional upset, and that can take many forms. So you might see a young person showing and talking about worries and fears about going to school. And this can often occur the night before school, the next day with school. And it's an interesting time to have this talk because the start of the year, the transition back into school after a long holiday period can certainly raise school refusal behaviours. Definitely depression, anxiety, anger, somatic complaints, sleep disturbance. So certainly I'll see a lot of young people who are struggling to get to sleep the night before school's due to start. It can present as frequent lateness, absences on significant days like assessments, young people complaining of poor teacher-student relationships. So for some reason feeling like they might not belong in the classroom in some way. Academic difficulties is another feature of it, and frequent requests to go home. Certainly in this day and age of technology, I'll have young people who are trying to contact their parents in the day on their phone because they're just finding that they can't cope and it's really distressing for them. Features can also include young people threatening self-harm, and that might sound like it only exists in adolescent stage, but it can certainly present itself in primary school age children as well. And it can be driven, school refusal can be driven by negative reinforcement, so avoidance of those unpleasant feelings, but also positive reinforcement. So that might look like attention from parents, even in a subtle way, and sometimes that can be negative attention. So it's positively reinforcing negative attention, but it is attention, and enjoyable activities. So, you know, if you're having a difficult time, if there's an opportunity to seek escapism through things like gaming or TV, internet use, then certainly you're going to be drawn to that if you're experiencing a lot of distress, and that gives you a break from those feelings. So it can be driven by negative reinforcement and positive reinforcement. So what are the drivers of school refusal? You know, what's leading to a young person showing these behaviours? I've broken these into different areas, and the first one is individual factors. So certainly psychological difficulties. So certainly for young people who are showing school refusal behaviours, we see a higher risk of anxiety and depression. Developmental disorders, so autism spectrum disorder and ADHD is overrepresented in young people who are showing school refusal behaviours. Physical health, so chronic illness, that can lead to having periods of time off and then difficulty transitioning back into school. Substance abuse, undetected learning disabilities is a really important one. Age and transition, so moving home or moving schools can certainly raise the risk of school refusal behaviours. And knowing these drivers really then can help us look at when someone's facing a transition, we really need to be mindful of how we're supporting and talking to them about that, because we know that that is certainly a risk factor for school refusal behaviours. Research shows that the ages, school refusal in terms of ages is most common ages 5 to 6. So really starting that, you know, that primary school age, 10 to 11, interestingly, and certainly in high school too. And of course, drivers of school refusal can be from friendship difficulties. So again, that gives us a sense of we need to make sure young people have a sense of belonging, and whether they're not getting a sense of belonging in their school that they're attending, we need to make sure they're feeling a sense of belonging in other areas of their life, whether it might be through sport or some other avenue or sense of community is so important for young people. In terms of family factors, certainly for young people experiencing or exhibiting school refusal behaviours, we see that certain family structures or functioning and parenting styles can be evident. It doesn't mean it's the only driver. Because it's a complex issue, you're going to see that, you might have a little bit of this driver and a little bit of that driver. It's certainly not one thing that's leading to school refusal behaviours. Also, how parents are their working life and how that makes them able to be involved in school. Socioeconomic disadvantage, parental physical or mental health problems. Certainly we can see that as a driver of school refusal. Domestic violence, so it might be a fear of harm coming to a parent that makes the young person want to stay at home. Low parental involvement in schooling, but also an overprotective parenting style. So that sense of not wanting their young person to experience distress. And we know that some young people can experience distress times 10 for some things. And so, managing that might raise then an overprotective sense in a parent and not want them to experience that distress going to school. School factors include a lack of classroom order and poor structuring of instruction, or in terms of neurodivergence being a risk factor for school refusal behaviours, making sure that school is at an instructional level that is targeting people or involving young people who are experiencing those difficulties, and or interaction with students. Certainly poor management of bullying and social isolation, and any school that I have worked in has been very passionate about helping young people and also helping stamp out bullying. But a lot of bullying can be quite covert, and if it seeps into that online world, young people tend to keep it quiet and not want to dob someone else in. And so the management of bullying is quite tricky. School transition, so that, like I said, the time that we are in right now, this week and next week and the next few weeks, certainly we'll see some school refusal behaviours coming about for people who have experienced school refusal in the past or have not experienced it before, but with coming from a long holiday period. So school transitions and changes in pedagogical practices. And by that, I mean, in primary school, you might go from having, you might have one teacher leading a lot of the instruction through the day. And then when you go into high school, you might have to get used to that change of, every period or, thereabout, you're going to have a lot of changes in teachers through the day. So again, that transition and change can be quite a trigger or quite unstabling for some people. Also community factors. So if a young person is in a school where there's a real pressure to achieve academically, I've certainly seen young people be frozen by a sense of perfectionism that they just can't shake, and that leading to school refusal behaviours. And also neighbourhood characteristics. So for instance, things like accessibility to transport. In terms of the consequences, so there was a Senate inquiry last year, the report which was released in August, and it had some really great defined objectives that it wanted to see happen in the next few years, some of which is around having a universal definition of school refusal and having one term that people feel comfortable with that we can start using, and also in terms of things like making sure that school refusal is part of teacher training, making sure that there are more partnerships between health and education, which is so tricky because we're all, there's so many complex issues that we might be dealing with. It's very hard to, maintain relationships like that or be able to have time to have those conversations. But certainly the Senate inquiry was a great step in looking at how do we go about, in Australia at addressing these issues that are coming up and certainly are more prominent since COVID. The consequences on a young person and their family can be really significant. So when a young person is exhibiting school refusal behaviours, they're certainly more likely to experience social adjustment problems because they're just not getting exposure to social relationships. And that obviously, when you don't have those social relationships, you can feel quite isolated, and that can certainly lead to mental health difficulties. Family conflict is a really big one. It's very stressful for families, in the mornings trying to get their young person to school. And I've had lots of situations where one parent has to stop working in order to be with that young person in the day. So it can really cause some family conflict and school staff stress too. There's a lot of time that can go into trying to help a young person with chronic school refusal behaviours to try to get to school consistently. Sadly, it also, school refusal behaviours is shown to lead to poorer health outcomes when that young person becomes an adult, and even leads to marital relationship difficulties too. So research has shown that. So it really is so important that we start to work on having a strategy that works for school refusal. NAPLAN results have shown that every day counts. So every day that a young person is away, it can affect their academic, results on NAPLAN. And a lot of families that I work with that will actually end up saying, like, academic out the window, we just want them to be happy. That's how difficult it can become. But certainly it shows that there's academic consequences to school refusal behaviours, as you would imagine. Interestingly, there's also research that shows there's impact on other children in the classroom. So if there is let's say in primary school, and there is a young person in the classroom who is finding it very difficult to get to school, when they are at school, the teacher might need to bring them up to speed, importantly, on what's been addressed, or it might cause a bit of disruption. And so research has shown that it actually can impact other children in the classroom. And so certainly we need to have a look at, how do we work all together in health, in education, to be able to address these issues. So important. So in terms of how do we address the issue, which I'm sure a lot of you have wanted to attend because of this, and what you'll find as I go through these next few slides is that it is very individual. I'll give you an example of a young person that I worked with who was attending boarding school. He had missed the majority of year 11. He had missed it. He had found it very difficult to get to school. He was experiencing anxiety and depression. He'd seen several psychologists, and he was under the care of a psychiatrist as well, for medication too. Yeah, he was missing very large chunks of his school, and certainly in the senior years, which are quite important. His mood disorder emerged probably about in year 9. And there was just a lag in terms of getting the right intervention. So we ended up at the stage that we were at year 11, and he hasn't attended much school at all, but still very motivated to complete his studies. There were one of his parents also experienced quite significant mental health. So it was a burden to try and help him get ready and force, really push him to get out the door. And so a lot of the work that I did and I was working with him in a school psychologist capacity, was a lot of phone contact that was encouraging and supportive. A lot of the time, someone who is exhibiting school refusal behaviours can often feel like parents are against them, the school is against them, because there's so much negativity and so much, can't you just get to school? Come on, you're almost like they are being disobedient, and not realising the amount of distress that their system is under. And so there was a real sense of negativity for this young person around that parent relationship, and also some school staff relationships. So certainly I had to, and it was quite difficult at times to be really encouraging each day that he wasn't there to say, what do you think about tomorrow? What could we try and tackle? What happened today? This is what you might have missed out on. Just really encouraging and supportive conversations. Certainly not that punitive approach, because it's just shown not to work. And so having a lot of meetings as well with key staff that were involved with that young person and parents, and trying to bring us together, and also getting liaison from stakeholders like the psychiatrist. And so, lots of conversations, but really from a supportive, encouraging direction. So I think I probably would have made 100 phone calls if I think back to it. Very short phone calls, but just trying to keep connected and build that relationship. The young person said one day that he thought that being in a boarding school environment might help. And there was quite interesting reactions from different people. So some school staff quite outraged that could be a possibility for him, that the school would try, because the school had a boarding capacity. And how could we kind of reward this behaviour by giving a spot, in the boarding house, and the burden that might have on other staff. And I really tried to advocate, if this young person has come up with this solution, we need to try it. The worst that can happen is it doesn't work, and we go back to where we are. And by being in the boarding house, it was like his anxiety didn't have a choice in the morning. He had to get up, he had to keep going, people around him were moving, his peers were moving, and he just kept going. And so it was like at home, the anxiety had, just stay home, or just don't get dressed. But in that boarding house environment, he had to go along with the pack. And of course, that solution's not going to work for everyone. And people don't have accessibility to a boarding house. And so the reason that I use that example is because it was so individual, and it was a lot of intensive, phone calls and meetings, and just that consistent encouragement to try and get him on track. And so he started the Year 12 academic year in a boarding environment, and was able to attend. I think there was a few days he couldn't attend when he just get exhausted from trying to be there. But he finished Year 12 and is currently studying to be a psychologist. He's almost fully registered. So, he was so motivated to complete his studies, but it took a lot of work, and it took a lot of relationship and rapport building. And I just don't think there's one size that fits all, or that, especially in our regions, that we have accessibility to certain levels of support, which make it difficult. I'm just going to the first slide that I want to show you around how do we address school refusal. This came from a researcher called Chris Kearney in 2016, and he's based in the US. And he proposed this multi-tiered level of support around school refusal, and it's been widely used around how do we tackle school refusal. You can see that there's tiers of interventions. And so the tier 1 interventions are universal interventions, and this is all about trying to use what's already established in school systems. So a lot of things around social emotional learning, programs that are already used widely in schools, and things like school readiness programs. So, they're really essential in terms of identifying those young people who might be at risk, and building those partnerships with a young person and with a family. So we know relationships is really key to addressing school refusal. So those are those tier 1 interventions that all students should have access to, and can really be a proactive approach around school refusal. The tier 2 interventions are more targeted, where we're starting to see young people present with some warning signs and trying to act on those early. And they can include things like teacher and peer mentoring programs. So that might be, established in the school system, but just how important that can be in terms of helping a young person feel like they belong. Relationships and belonging are absolutely key to helping school refusal. And then we move into increasing tier 2 interventions into something that's for tier 3 interventions. So these are for young people who are experiencing chronic school refusal. And so that might look like exploring alternative education programs. So that could be through TAFE pathways. You can also have, different school settings as well, There's one in Victoria called Into School, and it's a partnership between the University of Melbourne, a special school called Treverne School, which is a mental health focused school, and also the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne. And they have a school which is designed for young people in the teenage years who have shown school refusal for behaviours for at least 3 months and have a comorbidity, so that might be anxiety or depression. And they form a partnership for a maximum of 6 months between teachers and clinicians, and help a young person get back into school. But it's a very slow approach with a lot of exposure to a classroom setting. So that's an example of a alternative education program. We have things like that as well in our region. Like we have the Nexus Education Facility at John Hunter as well. So that's all about young people who are experiencing mental health that can't get to mainstream school for a period of time, and trying to help them gradually get back into that school system. And case management is really important in this chronic area, in the tier 3 intervention area. And as you can see, as you go up, obviously it's accounting for the severity increasing for young people. This model is great if we have capacity. It starts to fall to pieces when we get into areas where we see, high levels of chronic absenteeism, which means that we just can't case manage. We don't have endless amounts of case management within school systems, whether it be wellbeing staff or school counselling staff. And we might not have the services available to help facilitate treatment of underlying mental health issues. And that's why I guess, things like telehealth become very important, because it gives young people and families in our more regional areas access to those services, and can help as well, because if a young person is finding it difficult to get out the door to school, that telehealth element of, whether it's a psychologist, psychiatrist or GP can be really useful. I wanted to focus on addressing the issue in that pointy end of things. How do we, at that tier 3 where we're seeing, chronic absenteeism, what do we do when someone walks in our office? And I know we have different professionals joining the webinar tonight. So, when someone walks into the office or into the room that we work from, how do we go about helping them? One thing that's very important is assessment. Assessment including exploring what's the motivation behind the behaviour. So not just seeing that surface level, really looking at what sits behind that young person's distress not to go to school. So it could include assessment of school refusal, and what I've sent through to Phoebe, who will then send out, is a screener for school refusal behaviours, and that can be completed by both a young person and a parent, or just a parent if the child is in those younger years of primary school. So that's a screener for school refusal. It's widely accessible, and we should be using it more. And also there should be a sense of assessment of whether there's learning needs, or whether there's an underlying mental health issue, because we know that that's overrepresented for young people who are displaying school refusal behaviours. I put in here solution-focused questions, asking that young person when they're a certain age, what does a good day at school look like for you? What does that look like for you? And how do we facilitate to make that happen? So really giving them time to think about, a lot of time is spent on the other side, looking at what are the negative symptoms and what are the difficulties, but really looking at what does that look like for you, so we can get a sense of, one, the barriers, but also where they might be getting a sense of some kind of even a 1% enjoyment out of school. Also looking at things like CBT and exposure therapy for underlying issues. So CBT, so cognitive behaviour therapy for depression or anxiety that exists. And if a young person is finding it difficult in terms of whether it's financially or in terms of time, or actually getting into a professional to undergo cognitive behaviour therapy, there are things that are free that are great online. One that I use a lot is called Teen Strong. I've got this at the end on my resources page, but Teen Strong, which comes out of St Vincent's Hospital and the University of New South Wales. And it's an online CBT program that is free when it's prescribed by a professional. And so it's, you know, very accessible to young people who are finding it difficult to access that kind of treatment. It just requires a level of motivation. So probably for those people who are experiencing the more severe end of mental health, it might be difficult to have the motivation to complete something like that without having a therapist working with them. But certainly while people are waiting to get into a psychologist, it can be really useful, and even to work alongside when they are working with a professional too. Exposure therapy is all about how do we stage, you know, exposure to the school environment. So I would encourage a family to, you know, be making sure that their young person is still getting up and having breakfast and getting into their school uniform, even if there's, you know, there's no way that they're going to be able to get out of the house door. Just making sure those steps are happening, even if we can't get to that final step of getting into the school gates. And so it might look like as well, you know, someone getting dressed into uniform, getting into the car, getting dressed in the uniform, getting into the car, then going to a few blocks away from school. So just slowly increasing that stamina for that exposure to school. And certainly peer relationships can help with that in those adolescent years and in primary school years too, but just making sure that we use that network of other families to ask, you know, can your daughter text my daughter because she's finding it tricky to get to school, just to encourage her. And a friend meeting them at the gate can often help as well. And again, that's got to be at an individual level what works. I've just put there relationships are key. So relationships and sense of belonging. Meetings, liaison is just so essential in terms of school refusal behaviours. And what is possible at school? You know, how can we guarantee success for this young person? Schools can be very, very flexible if we sit down together and have a look at what this young person needs. So it might be that they find it very difficult to attend certain lessons. So then it might look at, you know, can they attend, you know, if it's maths they're finding really difficult, can they have support for maths work in the library? I've certainly seen young people who find break times very difficult. So can they attend in the morning and then go home for the break because it's too overwhelming for them? And then on the flip side, I've seen young people who find the breaks, you know, are the best part of the day, and they, you know, and so it's about facilitating, well, can we get them to school for just the breaks? We really need to think about what is school trying to achieve for a young person. You know, if it means that they're coming for breaks and they're not attending classes, that might need to be what it looks like until they get used to being in the school environment again. You know, you can also do things where it might be that the young person, you know, works with their classroom teacher just one-on-one in the classroom, and that helps build their tolerance for being at school. So we've got to look at what is possible in the school environment. How do we guarantee success for this young person? Because if they're constantly feeling like they're failing each day, they can't get to school, it's a pretty horrible feeling. Case management is really important at that pointy side of things. So having someone at the school system who can make the phone calls regularly, who can build that rapport with a young person. There's also school programs. So in school systems that I've worked with, certainly anxiety is #1 issue, mental health issue for wellbeing issue for young people, followed by school refusal. And obviously there's a big link between anxiety and school refusal. So schools have got different programs, like in the Catholic system, there's something called Beyond the Gates in our region that is delivered through Catholic Care, and the department schools have similar systems as well. A few years ago, there was research that came out that said we really are not getting on top of school refusal issues. We're only coming in too late for what that young person needs and family needs. And there was a push to make sure that if a young person was absent for 2 days in a row, that there was a phone call home. and that it might need to then escalate to what's called a ROSH report, or a risk of significant harm report, to family and community services around educational neglect. There's certainly things that are more punitive as well for young people, as well for families, where families can face court processes and fines, but it is very difficult to get to that stage. I've seen it a few times, but it certainly doesn't solve the issue, and can make the family feel quite isolated. But we really do need to be alerting authorities probably a lot earlier than we tend to. And certainly those phone calls home, there needs to be alerts on our school system saying this young person's been away for 2 days. We need to get on top of that and just have a conversation. Again, from that supportive point, we're really missing him at school. We're really missing Joanna at school today. We're really hoping that she can get back. Is there anything we can do that would help? Is everything okay at home? So the way that we have those conversations from the school perspective to families is very important. And just, again, punitive approaches, just research shows that it just makes the young person and family feel more isolated. Alternative schooling options, like I mentioned, and we have that in our region. There's different ones in Sydney as well, and Melbourne certainly seems to be a few steps ahead of us in terms of how they approach school refusal. I just wanted to put these resources, and I want to point out some of them. The PIP Ed one that's further down the list is a really great resource. It's free, and it was developed by Monash University, and it's an online program for parents where their young person is experiencing school refusal. It's for age 11 to 17, I think it is, but it's an online program. Great resource for parents to be able to explore in terms of helping their young person. So that one I think is really great, free, evidence-based. It is fantastic. There's another one called parentingstrategies.net, and it has a good workbook that parents can have a look at. This Way Up is the one I mentioned, where it's got that Teen Strong CBT program. Parent Works is another really great one. It's for ages 2 to 17, and it has an online program where a young person might be showing challenging behaviours, and challenging can be those school refusal behaviours, and it's free as well, and evidence-based. The Brave program is an online anxiety program for young people and for parents. And it also has a section for when it's more the younger primary school years, just for parents, because engaging children at that younger level, primary school age, in terms of CBT can be a little bit tricky. You're working a lot with parents. And so that's the Brave program. Again, it's free, so a great one to recommend to families. You've got the Smiling Minds program, so really looking at that wind down period the night before a young person is going to school. That wind down routine can be very important, so sometimes I'll get families to extend that wind down routine, and it can be very tricky in a busy, chaotic family environment, as I know every night. But Smiling Minds is a free mindfulness resource for young people, and so mindfulness is a very popular word at the moment. And if you're not sure about it, it's just where you are being mindful of moment to moment. So trying to stop that sense of living in the future, fearing what's going to come next, or relaying difficulties that have happened in the day or yesterday or a few years ago, whatever it might be. So trying to be in the moment, which can be really helpful for managing distress and staying calm. And so that's a great program to be aware of, Smiling Minds. There's also the Parent Line and Kids Helpline, Reach Out and Headspace, and they've got some great resources on there. And we want to be able to instill some hope for young people and families who are going through this, so they can be really great resources to use. And I'm just going to go back to Phoebe and just see if there's any questions that anyone might have about school refusal and what we might be able to do to tackle the problem.
Thank you so much, Claire. We have had 0 questions come through, which isn't always a bad thing. Maybe your presentation was just super, super thorough. Um,
Um,
but
I can probably talk about some other case studies that I wanted to just mention if I had a bit of time. So if people want to send through their questions, and I can just talk to a few of those case studies while
sure,
and
of
please, if
course.
you have any questions, please don't hesitate to raise them. But you know, just in terms of school refusal, like I said, in the education systems that I've worked in, it certainly is one of the significant issues that take up a lot of, oh, don't know why that keeps doing that. Hold on, I'll just get my presentation back. You know, so it takes up a lot of time and also can be quite, obviously have a significant impact on the young person who's experiencing it. And often I'll have families that say to their young person, look, just try, you know, to get to the end of this term, and then we can, because young people can often say, like, I just want to go to this different school, I want to go to this different school, and almost get to a point of romanticizing about what that school could look like for them, rather than actually dealing with what's going on underneath the school refusal behaviours. I've definitely seen in my time where I work with the family and they make the decision to change school and it works out for the better, you know, and it's much better for the young person. And I've certainly seen it go the other way, where they make the change and, you know, the school refusal behaviours, you know, emerge again, you know, and they become more isolated. And so I always advise families, don't have that carrot there that if you can get to the end of the term, then we can change schools. Giving that promise can just sometimes end up making you, you know, backing you into a corner where you don't, because young people are, you know, in my experience, they will often hold on to the negative when they're starting to attend school and things, as this wheel is slowly turning in the right direction. Sometimes they might have a bad day and go, well, hang on, you said if I got to the end of term, I could change schools. So I definitely advise families to be careful of that. Because it doesn't always work out. And even though you're seeing some improvement, they might not be feeling it just yet. So be really careful of that. So I've worked with families where they'll often ask me, you know, do you think that changing schools would be better? And, you know, there's just no crystal ball. So it's hard to, you know, I always say you just need to, I don't think it's the best time to be making a decision when you're under a lot of distress and stress. And sometimes people do and it works out, but, you know, I think you've got to be really careful making such a big decision. I had one young male that I was seeing, he's in year 8, and he would come to school and put his head down on the desk in every lesson. And he had good friendships, so that was a real strength. But he would put his head down in every lesson, and the teachers, you know, started to think that he was, you know, they'd check in with him, they'd try everything they could to encourage him, but he would just put his head on the desk and pretend to be asleep. So they would think that he wasn't interested at being at school, you know, maybe he was tired. They'd certainly tried to help him, but he just kept putting his head on the desk. He finally came into the school counselling system and started to talk about it, and opened up, and was actually experiencing quite a significant depressive episode as a result of having some undiagnosed learning disabilities. And because his behaviour, putting his head on the desk, people have tried to engage him, but that's what he's showing. You know, he just presented as being quite oppositional and just not interested. When actual fact, he had some significant issues around feeling like a failure, significant self-esteem issues. And so helping facilitate for him to have a cognitive assessment and assessed for learning disabilities, and it to show that he has dyslexia, and then to be able to, the school to be able to support him with that. And he obviously had to be on board with that, which wasn't always easy. And, you know, having his family on board with all of those processes, it did take time. But in the end, he actually left school, you know, to complete an apprenticeship, and was much happier. But, you know, at least he had that chance of actually, you know, finding out that, you know, there wasn't something that he wasn't a failure, it was that he learnt in a different way. And so, it just shows you how important it is to look beyond what behaviours might be presenting. School absenteeism can be a really big indicator, or school, that school withdrawal, that withdrawal from engaging in the classroom is a real risk factor for school refusal. And it's an indicator that something's going on for that young person's well-being. We need to have a look at what's behind that challenging behaviour in the classroom. And it is difficult to get into professionals to have those cognitive assessments, but it just is so important, because then that young person can get supported for their learning difficulty. So that was one example. Another example that comes to mind is in primary school, where a young girl was showing school refusal and would have big outbursts coming into the school gates, and it was really difficult for school staff, and it was was in an area where there was socioeconomic disadvantage, and there wasn't a lot of resources. And so it was a burden on the teachers in terms of starting the day like this, to try and help manage this, this young girl's, meltdowns as she was coming into school, and it was distressing for other students as well, because she was so distressed. And often it would lead to her mum, grabbing her forcefully out of the car, because it does get to that point. I've seen it lots of times, where it just is so frustrating, and parents have to get to work and do other things, and if it happens once, it's a different story to when it's happening day after day after day. And what transpires after building a relationship through her teacher slowly, so doing something where a lot of the time students can get pulled out of the classroom, and it doesn't necessarily help, particularly in primary school where they're with mostly one teacher all day. It doesn't particularly help build that relationship and rapport with the teacher if they're getting pulled out, say, to whether it's to counselling or to appointments or whatever it might be, or to learning support. They miss those times of building that rapport and relationship with their teacher. And so instead we tried something where it was the teacher was relieved for in the learning support teacher or another teacher would take over the class for even just for 10 minutes, where that teacher could then build a relationship with that young girl, whether it was just doing some craft with her or playing cards with her, just something that was just slowly building rapport. And then through that, what transpired is that girl had that young girl was finding it very difficult because there was domestic violence occurring in the household, and she was wanting to protect her mother. And so, young people don't always have the words to express how they feel. Even adults don't have that. And so, her behaviour was really showing that something wasn't okay. And it took a process to get to the bottom of that. And when the family could have support, and when that young person could have support, attendance can change. It's not easy, but it definitely can change if the right supports are in place. So those are just a few of the case studies, that I've worked with, and just trying to manage to help bring about change for that family and young person. But it's not easy.
Claire, I will jump in there. Thank you so much for sharing those case studies.
That's all right.
I don't know what happened, but we've got a bajillion questions now, which is great. Thank you so much to everyone for sending them through. So I'll start at the top. What sort of funding options are available within the school system? The intensive case management and meetings that you've mentioned can be crucial.
Yeah, so it's really difficult because each school will work in an individual way. There's certainly more positions in school settings around wellbeing staff or more partial care, and so that then allows a bit more case management. Sometimes it comes under, depending on what schools, how much school counselling capacity they have. Sometimes a school counsellor will facilitate the case management, but in my experience, a lot of school counsellors have got an overwhelming caseload. And so in terms of case management, it just depends on the size of the school and what funding they have, because they have different funding from the government, and depending on what disabilities might exist in the school setting. And so that case management might be a teacher, or it might be a learning support teacher. It could be a school counsellor in some schools. It could be a wellbeing staff member in some schools. So each school exists differently, but there's certainly a push for greater rebates from the government in terms of getting psychological help for families and young people. Yeah, we're yet to see that, but there's certainly a push from that Senate inquiry last year. That's one of the recommendations. You know, we need to see, you know, more accessibility to services, you know, and where I work, you know, the child and adolescent mental health teams are just, you know, they're just at capacity, like most probably professionals sitting on this webinar. And so that case management just really comes from how an individual school operates. There's not kind of certain funding for that. It just depends on what needs are within the school and what capacity is there.
Okay, great. This question comes through from Thomas.
Yeah.
The question is about secondary gain. Often in my experience has been that it's difficult to shift anything forward regardless of the issues, so long as there is some secondary gain for staying at home, either like access to TV or video games. However, when suggesting the removal of these things to families or parents are often very distressed about the idea of making things tougher on their child and may drop out. Do you have any suggestions about how to approach these issues?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really tricky one. And I think it's looking at why is the young person, what's the motivation behind that secondary gain? If it's watching TV, is it because they're experiencing a level of depression and they need to seek an escape? And talking about that openly, you know, when I work with a young person, I would say, like, you know, this is what a secondary gain means. And I think this is happening for when you're watching TV or when you're gaming or when you're going on your phone. And we need to try and navigate that. And it might mean that you have reduced time for that. And we talk to your mum and dad about taking your phone for a period of time, because, you know, ultimately we know that if you've got access to that, the anxiety and depression is going to want you to want that, you know, because it feels so bad. So really trying to externalize those feelings, that it's not the young person that's, you know, showing bad behavior, but there's a reason for it. And definitely I'll talk to parents about, you know, the internet needs to be turned off at home at these times of the day, if that young person is staying at home. And if they're staying at home, if they are waking up late, they're watching TV, they're not doing any schoolwork, yeah, I would like to do that too, you know, so of course it's motivating to stay at home. So making sure that they're in their school uniform, and that just like at school, they don't have access to their phone at certain times. So, you know, making sure that that system is followed at home, and also that they're completing some kind of work that is sent from the school. And sometimes that can be tricky, but, you know, a lot of schools do use different online programs. So if they're completing some kind of work, it doesn't have to be at the full level of what they might be doing in the classroom, but maintaining some connection with some schoolwork is really important. So, you know, it's having those honest conversations with that young person and with the family. And I'd often say to a young person that I'd see in significant distress in a school setting, I would say, I'm going to use a scale of 0 to 10 with you, where, you know, 0 is absolute rock bottom, you know, really worst day, you know, worst day of the year. And 10 out of 10 is, you know, the best day of the year, you know, your birthday or Christmas or something like that. And if you're telling me that you are getting down to 0 because your distress is so high, we will do something about it. I'm not going to force you to stay here. So really trying to empower them, that I'm not going to go and you know, grab someone out of the car. I've certainly offered to go and, you know, meet young people in the mornings to get them to school, and programs like Beyond the Gates, that's what they actually do, is that they make sure a young person has breakfast and they go and pick them up to get to school, but not all schools have the capacity to do that. But yeah, I think secondary gains is so important to have open honest conversations about, and really using a scale that young person can say, I'm out, I can't do this. Things like timeout cards can be really useful in the school setting as well, where a young person can say, I just need a bit of timeout, and they're not asked too many questions, and they can go to a space where they can just have 10 minutes to then try and re-enter. And sometimes I'll work with people who use that, that timeout card. They might use that several times in a day. But they're still at school, and if we get too focused on, but hang on, they're not completing this assessment, hang on, they're not doing this, we've got to be careful that we are guaranteeing success in some way. So making sure that a young person has those tools and they understand how to use it, and the school staff understand how to use it, where there's no questions asked, but they'll be followed up just to check if they're okay. And the families know, the parents know how that's going to be used, is really important. And something like a check-in, check-out, where a staff member might check in with the young person before they actually go home early, because sometimes that can become a little bit too loose, and I'll find that a young person's going home early and no one's realizing, and they're like, oh, I thought I could go home early. So you've got to be really careful that you have something like an attendance plan, which schools use, that is pretty firm, but everyone is on the same page about, and tools like the timeout cards, everyone understands how that will be used, and just be careful that it won't be abused. So secondary gains is certainly something that needs to be addressed, and things like turning the internet off at certain times, or having certain passwords, and removing phones for a period of time. Sometimes I'll have families who will say, but if I take their phone at night, then they say, if they're in a mental health crisis, or they, feel suicidal, they've got no one to access. And it's really important to reinforce, because I've certainly had young people who will be up all hours of the night on their phone, and then it's much harder to get to school the next day if they're so tired. Sleep is so essential. So making sure that phones are certainly not in their rooms, and that if they are feeling suicidal, that they can go to their parent and say, I'm really not feeling good. Often there can be an over-reliance for adolescents on other adolescents for that safety net, but it puts a lot of burden on the other young person, and is just not effective. It's not a professional, and so it can be really dangerous to do that. So programs like mental health first aid for teens can be really useful in school settings, because it's teaching the young person about mental health, but also about the importance of boundaries when they're trying to support a friend with mental health, because they often try to keep it quiet. And so young people can say, I need my phone at night so that I can, I can help my friend who's having trouble, or, I myself might feel suicidal and I need to reach out to my friend. But we have to reinforce those boundaries, that is just not effective and not safe for that young person or their friend. So secondary gains is a very important one, and I just think open, honest conversations about, hey, this is something that exists, and I think it's happening with this, and it is happening for a reason. It's not just a secondary gain because they can't be bothered.
Thank you. Next question comes to us from Jessica Downey. Hi Claire, I work at Headspace and run a lot of school programs. We find that with school refusal, a lot of it in our area is to do with bullying and cyberbullying. So schools have banned phones in the classroom, and we have cyberbullying programs that we deliver within the schools to educate the students around the impacts for both parties from bullying. The program has a success rate, however, based on feedback from students, the bullying continues due to a lack of support or involvement from teachers in bullying situations. How can we educate the staff on school refusing behaviours as a result of unmanaged bullying?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's such a great point. And I think, that's one of the reasons that I wanted to do this presentation, is because I think we've got to be able to work together more effectively. I think we're all, in whatever capacity we're in, whether it's as an educator, whether it is as a health professional, whether it's at Headspace or CAMS or whatever it might be, that we've got so many people on our caseload to try and help, that it becomes overwhelming, and we've got to somehow figure out how we can carve out that time to show, this is what this program is about. Can you reinforce those strategies in a lesson somewhere, whether it's in the teenage years, in PDHPE, can there be a reflection of what we've done? Because I find that a lot of the time these programs are so fantastic, And it might be that teachers are so exhausted from what they've got to do that they might, when those programs are running, they might be doing some other work or responding to certain emails from parents. So they might not be as involved as what could be helpful. And so I think when going into schools in a headspace capacity, it's really got to start at that leadership where it's a meeting with the principal saying, this is what we need for this to be effective. We've got so many great programs that exist. There's never been a time of greater wellbeing resources and never been a time where we're drowning so much in wellbeing issues. And so there's so much great resources out there, but we've got to communicate, and at that leadership level, can you make sure you remind staff at that next staff meeting that this is what's happening and this is what leads to effectiveness of this program, and it's follow-up. It's not coming in and sticking this in, okay, tick that box, we've done that cyberbullying talk. It's how's that message going to be replicated this term? Like asking that, this needs to happen, because staff might not know that that's what leads to effectiveness in those wellbeing programs. Is it that, they have a mentor program and, the e-safety commissioner website is brought up and they go through a case study and how do you report, and they practice reporting on cyberbullying. I think those messages, how do we reinforce them in the school system? And I think it's got to be conversations before we go into that, because schools are wanting those programs, but they might not realise how to make it effective for young people. Where are the anonymous avenues for young people to report on bullying issues? It's difficult for schools to respond to cyberbullying because often that can occur outside of the school hours. And so, some schools that I've worked in have used, anonymous bullying surveys where it's talking about, who do you feel like is someone that might be perpetrating bullying in your year level. And the staff use those, anonymous surveys to just look at, okay, how do we create more pro-social lessons in different areas, whether it be PDHP or it be in mentoring, and how do we make sure that there's more monitoring, asking, if young people are saying there's cyberbullying that's occurring, talk about, where is it happening, what websites is it happening at, if it's bullying because it can be so covert in school systems, where is it happening, at what times, who with, is there anyone else around, and just making sure that we do things like have increased school staff monitoring at those times, because often young people don't want to dob in, the person who's the perpetrator. There's certainly a lot of protection around the perpetrator because of the consequences. So so I think it's got to be those conversations at that leadership level. We're delivering this program, we need this for effectiveness, like those follow-up conversations. Can you remind staff at a staff meeting? Can you make sure that, in PDHPE there's reference to the materials that we've used? Can school staff that are present in that lesson really need to be present and not on their phone, because that's essential for the effectiveness of this program. So that's what I would say about that.
Thanks, Claire. The next question comes to us from Casey Sullivan. Specifically for GPs, is there anything we can do, or is it mostly facilitating referrals to support? It seems addressing school refusal is designed for the school to take the lead.
Yeah, I think that in terms of GPs, I think they are a really essential piece of the puzzle. And often that, a family might be seeking support around investigating a possible physical illness when it could be, mental health in origin in terms of stomach complaints, headaches, things like that. So often it can come through the doors of the GP. And so I think it's just making sure that we're using screeners like the DASS-Y for, adolescents, which is the depression, anxiety, stress scale for youth, to make sure that we're being thorough in that investigation, whether there might be something else going on. The school refusal assessment scale that will be available as part of this presentation, that's another one that's really great. Making sure we're really clear on, okay, how many days, in the last 2 weeks have you been absent from school, or have you not been able to attend a full day of school? So just being really clear, because sometimes that data even at the school level, can get a bit muddled. And so just making sure we're jumping on those early warning signs and offering parent support. I think parents are finding it really difficult. So, using those resources, I've created a pamphlet that that Phoebe will send out as well, that I hope that people will use, and particularly in GP practices, which is about what are the warning signs of school refusal and what resources can you turn to. So definitely facilitating referrals, but also that education around, this is the area that I think, these are some of the features that are presenting for this young person. I think we need to investigate this. So just that parent education as well is really important through that GP avenue.
All right, great. Next we have some questions from Nicholas, and he's prefaced with, spoiler alert, I'm a behavioural optometrist. But had the boy in the case study had his eyes examined properly, because some of those symptoms are very common with vision-related learning difficulties.
Yeah, so any investigation that is around learning difficulties will certainly include recommendations for either hearing checks, vision checks, things like that, because the trouble is, and why school refusal can present as such a chronic and complex issue, because there can be those different levels, and we really have to rule out, is there a visual problem? Is there a hearing problem? Is there a mental health difficulty? Is there a learning difficulty? Working in high schools, I'd certainly see a lot of anxiety and depression, but you could see from their academic achievement that something, there was something that was going on that had just been gone under the radar, for a long time. So you certainly, when a professional is doing a learning assessment, including a cognitive assessment, they'd definitely be looking at, what's happening on the hearing and vision, has that been checked, certainly.
Perfect. And our last question, again from Thomas. How have you approached supporting kids that don't have a sense of belongingness? Example, no peer relationships or difficulty establishing relationships. I'll be very interested to hear some examples from cases, if any come to mind.
Thanks, Thomas. Yeah, definitely. Like if I've got a young person who is presenting with a lot of difficulty with a sense of belongingness, not only in the school context, but other contexts, like a difficulty establishing meaningful relationships, I would be wanting to then look at a full assessment around, that springs to my mind, is this person on the autism spectrum or have some difficulty in terms of relationship building? Has that young person experienced some kind of trauma in their background that also can present with a sense of difficulty establishing meaningful relationships? So there can be a crossover between autism spectrum and trauma-related presentations. So, I'd be wanting to do a thorough assessment around background, presentation. I can't remember if Thomas, what role Thomas has, but if I was a psychologist working with that, I'd be really wanting to have a thorough history, a family history. How have the parents got meaningful relationships? And what does that look like? Definitely with young people that I've worked with, I've had some people form more meaningful relationships through things like karate, and that's their kind of, that's where they get their sense of belonging while trying to get to school. I've had working with school staff where you really talk about, meet with school staff about, we need to be conscious about who this young person is paired up with, because they're really finding it difficult to have a sense of belonging in the school environment. It could be that what I've referenced before around that teacher connection time, where it's having that 10 minutes, maybe twice, maybe 3 times a week, where the teacher gets relieved and they can try and build a relationship with that young person. And what's their relationship like with their family or their extended family? Sometimes it's looking for, is there a mentor type role with an uncle or a coach somewhere? Sometimes it's, a young person having a sense of belonging through their gaming world, and that's okay. Just making sure that families don't take a punitive approach, that they can have zero gaming if they don't go to school, because that's where they get their sense of belonging from. So if we're completely taking that away, that makes it really difficult, quite a negative world. So, you know, making sure that they have access to that at appropriate times for appropriate lengths of time. So, you know, sometimes being creative about where you can get a sense of belonging is important when you work with young people, but I'd certainly be wanting to get a thorough history for that young person.
Okay, great. That's the end of all of our questions. So
That's great.
I just wanted to thank everyone for sending their questions in, and they were like meaty questions, so really impressive. Thank you. I just thank our wonderful presenter Claire. Really, I think it's, you know, touched a lot of people, and a lot of people can relate to and or have been affected by this topic. So thank you so much for taking the time to present. And I want to thank everyone for attending, because it's usually dinner time or family time or just relaxing time, or if it's a really bad day, extra work time. So thank you for spending your evening with us. We really do appreciate it.
Yeah, I would like to second that, because I think it's the only way that we can kind of get on top of some of these wellbeing issues for young people, you know, which is our future. And I think, you know, just coming together and talking about different case studies and what's worked and what hasn't and different ideas is the only way, I think, to approach these, and just bringing together, you know, different people who are interacting with young people, whether it be GPs or whether it be, you know, physios, psychologists, teachers. You know, I just think it's so important. So I appreciate it. So thank you. And thank you for the opportunity, Phoebe, to present.
Oh, good. Thank you so much. And as I said, the presentation and the actual slides will be on our website. So all of Claire's resources that she's lovingly added in will be available to you as well. So thank you so much, and look after each other.
Thanks, Phoebe.
Bye.